Here we are starting.
Here we are starting. This is Totally Classic. I'm Brendan McNamara.
This is Andy Swindler.
Yeah, that's us. And we are going to try to do a Fast and Furious episode today. So let us know whether you like that, whether you like it. It sounds, there's no way to make this sound not prurient, but if you like it hard and fast, is that like good? Does that feel good? Does that feel right to you? Let us know.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that. And when I said my name, I almost said andyswindler.com. So I guess it's like,
Wow. We are, hey, listen, we are increasingly in a virtual world. So it's very, I think it'd be perfectly normal. I mean, that's sort of embracing the metaverse outside of the metaverse.
indeed. So I know we do have the Fast and Furious episode today.
Yes.
Are we having guests from the movie or no?
Just Paul Walker here in spirit. RIP. He's a dead one. Yeah. Okay. So originally in the outline for this second episode, this continuation of this conversation, I had us going through three spokes of the wheel of the Sylvia Duckworth one, especially. We had sort of started to go through like one or two in the last one. That's why I was like, oh, let's just do that. I think for a 35 to 45 minute episode, three spokes is way too much. So do you mind pulling that up, the Duckworth, and just kind of, because I think if we could just go through one, maybe even like what might be the most, if there's like one spoke of the wheel that's most central, like, or most centrally accepted, would be really good. Because I just have a bunch of questions.
Yeah.
About the spokes generally.
And just a little context in case somebody's dropping right into the middle of this episode.
Yeah.
Our last episode, we talked about intersectionality, and one of the tools to at least understand what that even means is there's several versions of this kind of model, but the one I like is called the Wheel of Power and Privilege. Excuse me. Wow. Wheel of Power and Privilege and burps from Sylvia Duckworth.
Yeah.
And we'll, if we haven't already, we'll have that in the Tumblr. And I don't know if we'll ever post videos, but I will share my screen just so people can see that. So what I'm looking at is a very colorful wheel. Looks like, for those who may remember Trivial Pursuit, kind of reminds me a little of the little wedges.
Yeah.
And it's
pieces of pie.
Pieces of pie. Yep. And it's got three different layers coming in. From the center is the big word power right in the middle. And then there's a layer, a ring closer to power. And then there's a secondary ring. And then there's a thinner ring out on the edge, along with the word marginalized. And every one of these wedges has a different category. There are 12 wedges total. And the categories are skin color, formal education, ability, sexuality, neurodiversity, mental health, body size, housing, wealth, language, gender, and citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
My interpretation of this model, which is fairly common, is that the closer you are, if you hold identities that are closer to the center, you have more power in our society here in America. And if you hold identities that are more on the marginalized, more on the margins or the outside of the ring, you have less power, less proximity to power. So.
Okay, interesting. Okay, that was one of my questions. So we had originally last week we talked about in this interrogating this question, is intersectionality useful? That the term was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, who was actually sort of part of the same unit of lawyers and legal scholars who sort of created critical race theory as well. So this is all an intermingled concept. And she had applied intersectionality, or sort of coined the term, to apply to discrimination lawsuits wherein Black people were not being discriminated against and women were not being discriminated against. Generally, there's multiple cases, but just generally that's sort of the premise. But where Black women were being discriminated against, and presently she was saying under the law, there's really no way to prove, to even make this case, because it's not a race discrimination case strictly, and it's not a sex gender discrimination case strictly. So it would be helpful for us in the legal realm to be able to examine identities that sort of intersect or overlap or coexist within particular individuals. And at some point, and Crenshaw too, it seems, has pushed back on where her term has been kind of taken into this realm or whatever. She said that around the Women's March. She was like, this is not what I meant. So I'm very curious about when it turned into the thing that you're saying, because even if we took what her premise was into this framework, my reading is like, if I was familiar with her work, would be like, oh, here's an attempt to sort of look at the world and predict statistical likelihood of facing discrimination based on these categories. But at some point it came into like power or access to power. Do you know, in terms of any of the things that you've ever learned about it, or people have like taught about it? Has anyone ever talked about that transition? Because I don't know, but if you see that as like, that's a big transition to kind of, that's a huge leap in usage from being sort of about when discrimination arrives, we should be able to examine multiple categories at once, as opposed to this is a graph of the constant state of being of all human beings.
I'm not sure. Your last characterization might be a slight exaggeration, but,
okay.
But probably only slight.
Yeah.
And some people I'm sure hold that. I don't hold really that anything's that absolute.
Yeah.
But I have, and this is attached to a piece that I had written, and I think we're going to get into that a little bit later around, looping back around to like spoon theory.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of folks kind of in this space hold those as synonymous, that if you are more likely to be discriminated against, then you have less access to power.
Oh, interesting. Okay. But that's a huge logical leap, right? In terms of that would only apply. Well, let's flip it, for example. Okay. So Black men, right, are more likely to be murderers than a bunch of other categories of intersectional identity, just based on statistics, right? And that's one of the reasons that you could put Black and on the outside of, let's say, a power wheel. But that doesn't mean that all Black men are more murderous than everyone else. You know what I mean? So then it's a huge logic leap to then go, okay, because that circumstance is more likely to arise, therefore all who bear that identity are more that thing. You know what I'm saying? That's what I'm saying. That's like the big, to me, that's the big logical leap from the Crenshaw usage or to this one. And I'm just like, and it may be legit, maybe people, but I don't know.
So as I hear that, so I want to make sure I understand that. So you're saying of the people who commit murder,
yeah,
there is a statistical
disproportionate representation. Thank
you, of Black men.
Yeah.
And I agree that does not therefore mean that any Black man you encounter on the street is more likely to be a murderer than anybody else. Is that right?
Well, no, that's literally what it would mean, but it wouldn't mean that every Black man has that, carries around in him a more murder, like he is, that every individual person is more statistically murderous. You know what I mean? So it would mean, yes, that you would, every Black man you encounter is more likely to be a murderer, right? If that's, let's say, this is again all theoretical, like this is just whether, again, this is, we struggle with all these categorical statistics when you're like, well, incident based on incident of encounter or incident blah, 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 or incident of prosecution or all that sort of stuff, right? Murder is just a nice clear one because there's usually a dead body involved. But I'm just saying then this applies it beyond statistical likelihood, meaning if you ran into a let's say a white citizen, they would be more likely to have power, to be in a position of power. Yes, that's true. But that doesn't mean that individual has more power and access to power. just like that individual, yes, would be more, you could more accurately statistically predict as a guess that that person would be so, but you certainly can't make the logical leap to be like, you then are that like implicitly in and of yourself. It would actually it would just be a statistical analysis.
Okay, I think I'm tracking that. Yeah, I don't. I
So
don't
then
know.
by being
I don't know
a
that
white,
the, I don't know that the intention of this is to say that all people in these categories are absolutely share these characteristics.
right?
But
Like if you,
it's tricky.
go ahead.
It's tricky because it's like, I don't know, like there's dissenting opinions. I don't remember a few months ago, I saw like a whole panel of Black people basically, denying a lot of things that, I've come to believe in terms of racism and whatnot. So
Yeah.
And I know personally on a more personal basis, there's a Black woman in my life that, it's just fascinating because she grew up, she's basically like a hippie, she's just like, racism, what's that?
Yeah.
So,
Well, and it's not a concern statistically to, like, just based on polling, Gallup, Pew Research, that sort of stuff. Like racism is not a special concern of the Black community, just based on polling of Black people who answer polls, which you can hold that as loosely as you want.
and that's interesting. So my reaction there is like kind of paternalistic, frankly. It's like, oh, well, gee, maybe they don't know how these systems are stacked against them or something. So how accurate is a poll? And that may be true. That may not be true.
Yeah. No, all we're both doing, obviously, and this is the thing we were just talking about before we recorded. We're all making our best guesses, right? And arranging this wheel too. You're just kind of like, this is my best guess of how this thing could be playing out, But anyway, that was just one leap. I wanted to be like, that's a big leap. And again, I do have, I'm a independent, so I have conservative and liberal aspects, and I'm open to all kinds of thought, hence the liberal. I'm actually very liberal in that way, in the specifically what liberal means, but I am conservative too. And then I'm like, wait, which way are we going? Wait, if we're going to leap a chasm, especially as relates to identity.
Well, and it is challenging. Like I appreciate this because I'm sure I'm guilty of using absolutist language. Hopefully not as much recently, but at various times.
Yeah,
it's convenient. I mean, it's very. I think that's a problem on kind of all sides of probably all arguments. Is the tendency to just want to oversimplify things.
Yeah, too quickly.
Yeah, kind of find the convenient answer, and I know that's a lot of what you're about. Is like, no, let's really dig deeper and actually do more research and find as many data points as we possibly can to make the guesses more educated. So I'm curious. Yeah, I think that's probably at the root of a lot of this. Am I right? Is this? It's the question of like, does this absolutely apply to everybody in these categories? If people would even agree that they're in these categories, which is kind of a side.
Yeah, that's another huge difficulty with, of course, that. And maybe we can jump into in a second the affinity groups answer, because we were texting about what affinity groups are, because I'm vaguely familiar with it, but I think I'm probably familiar with it through a negative lens, and I think you're familiar with it through a positive lens. So I'd like to know what the positive interpretation is. But yeah, I think that's listen. And I say this out loud, that I understand that anytime you make a graph of something in trying to explain the wheel of power privilege, and I think Sylvia Duckworth's drawing is actually super cool. I like how she did it. I like the vibe of it generally. I'm glad you used this one, and it's also less intimidating because it's handwritten vibe. Anytime you do that, you are cementing a concept. But this is a great thing about making graphs, that you're like, okay, well, what happens when we cement this concept? And this is one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this topic, because we're already in the realm where this topic, this sort of theory of the wheel of power and privilege, these application of these critical theories is already being applied. It's being applied in law, in public schools, in private schools. It's being taught as though not theory, but real. As far as the information I've literally seen of people, of administrators of schools talking about it and reading the language in bills and that sort of stuff. So it says these, and now in medical schools too. I sent you a recent thing. that it's not saying these things are theoretical or something we're talking about or considering, but it says these things are bedrock foundational fact, and then the basis upon which adjudications are being made. And to me, that just feels, again, it feels rushed to me, but I'm unfamiliar with the concept, and I'm just coming to learn about it in the past, whatever, 6 or 7 years, you know. So anyway, I want to just allow that there is, obviously, I'm well aware that there's a spectrum of understanding anytime you put something in graph form, so that we can understand it.
Are you familiar with this quote from George Box? All models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yeah. Yeah. But, and that's the question here. That's the great thing about this, because we're looking at this model and we're like, okay, well, it certainly has rightness and wrongness to it. But
I don't see the wrongness, Brendan.
yeah. And then but then is it useful is the question. And I think that's a good question. I mean, saying, is it right? You're like, well, parts of it might be, is the only thing a reasonable person could say, right? Parts of it might be, and maybe it's a big part or a small part. I don't know. But is it useful is the question. And I, as much as I don't buy this wheel because it hasn't been justified yet. And so I'm still in the I don't know phase. I still have questions. And then, but is it useful? At least to me already, and I know we still have about 20 minutes. I mean, is intersectionality useful? Yes. I mean, is this wheel of power and privilege useful? I'm probably a no at the moment, but I don't know. I'm more of an I don't know. But I think that's a great quote, because that really does cement it, where you're just like, and this is maybe the thing too, you're talking about with absolutes, where it's just like, can you say this is useful? Yes. Useful for what? I don't know. We'll answer that later. You know?
That's, yeah, I like that breakdown.
Yeah. Oh, I have a question too. Let me answer. What is power in the middle? Like what, like, so like, what would that, this is my big question too. What is the framework used to make these assessments of like who's closer to power or farther away from power? And then really what would exemplify power?
Yeah, I think, you know, this, I would put power into the same kind of bifurcation as I do racism, right? Where there's interpersonal power and then there's systemic power.
Yeah.
I think most of these conversations lean more towards systemic power because that's, you know, that's what influences generation after generation after generation in terms of having access to opportunities and wealth, etc. And as I read this, that in a lot of ways that feels like that makes sense to me in my bias, that this is useful, you know, because if you're, you know, I don't know, a cisgendered man who's a citizen of the United States, who's white, who or lightly melanated, that's actually fascinating. I hadn't noticed that. So earlier I noticed, in the last episode, I noticed that Sylvia chose skin color as a designation other than race.
Yeah.
But then it's dark in the margins, different shades in the middle, and then white in the middle. Or white, sorry, white.
Closest to power.
Yeah, closest to power. We should say like center ring, middle ring, outer ring. I'll do that.
Yeah, you go. Oh,
the outer ring is dark, different shades is the middle ring, and then white is the inner ring.
Well, power to do what though is my question. You know what I mean? Like, let's look at male, right? Because that's a pretty good one. Like women didn't have, oh wait, no, it's not in there. I didn't mean that. That was not a gotcha. Sorry, I thought I was like male and female is not in there.
Well, yeah, that's I think we have a whole episode about gender, but anyway, I got a little sidetracked, but it just leapt out at me because she chose white versus let's say light, right? Like light would be a corollary to the rest of how she built that category. So no, that's intriguing. I don't mind the word white. You don't like it. Here on this show, we decided to say melanated, but in any case, I'm going to keep going. But let's say whatever we designate that, it's you know, white or lightly melanated, hetero, robust mental health. You own property. You're rich. You've got a lot of education, college, post-secondary college. You're able-bodied, like that. maybe one way to think about this is like, oh, if we could somehow find statistics of the people who hold power systemically, and to me that means they have the power to influence governments, they have the power to influence corporations, they have the power to influence major aspects of people's lives. Are most of those people kind of check off a lot of these boxes? I think.
And the question would have to be, right? It would have to be disproportionately, right? So like, let's say like in the gender, right? Like a cisgender person even would be 99%, 98%, 99%, something like that, right? Of the US population. So would they be represented in those offices of quote unquote power? It would have to be disproportionate, right? It would have to be beyond their population distribution in and of itself, even to just start the conversation, even just to go, this is a problem, potential problem to look at, not even to identify the problem. So like rich people would have to be which I think that's a good one, right? Rich people would have to be disproportionately represented in order for us to go, ooh, there might be a problem there. And I would say that's the easiest. Like, I think people who are in positions of corporate and or political power do tend to be high income individuals. And there's a multitude of reasons for that.
Yeah, it's funny. I was my dad's been in the hospital this week, and I visited him, and on the way out, one of the, I think, clear benefits for me of kind of swimming through these waters is just changing my awareness, and I'm walking out of the hospital and I just see all these photos, and there's the 3 CEOs. They appear to be older white men.
Yeah.
There's all the trustees. They're all white, but yeah, there's some women. And then there was, just on and on through like all of the governing kind of bodies of this hospital, all displayed down the hall you walk to like enter the hospital. I found one person that didn't look white to me.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, okay, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Hospital's a good example. That's a hell of a lot of power, right, to influence people's health and livelihood.
Yeah. And then why do we cluster?
Yeah.
Or do we cluster? This is the interesting thing. So maybe that gets into affinity groups. So I was like, that's another big question about this. Like, what is power? And then how does a straight person have more access to power and influence? It doesn't seem like that. But again, I lived in Los Angeles for 20 years and then I also absorb media. That's in which case I would say like gay men have more overt influence in media, in art, fashion, media, everything that I spend my life around. And so I was like, that's simply just not the case at all. So I don't know so that's why I was like, what's power? Because I was like, in terms of social influence, it's not those heterosexual isn't, rich is, English is, cisgender, I don't think it's disproportionate. Citizen, it's probably white, no. Education, maybe I don't know. That's middle. That's like a question mark. And then able-bodied is some disability. I actually think is probably the most influential, rather than able-bodied people. I don't think able-bodied are the most influential people at all. In terms of those sorts of power things, you know what I mean? So that's the answer. This varies, and you've talked about this too. That like if you're in a particular space, that takes this as kind of like a graph upon which the world is, that this can actually get flipped. So then within certain groups, the dynamic is opposite. So it just, a problem can be that the power dynamic just gets rearranged and it's still in a power dynamic,
Yeah. And
that part's interesting.
Yeah. And that you've mentioned a category I had left out earlier, media, right? Which is obviously an enormous source of power to influence people and change lives. And we've seen that's a lot of where we started, right? Talking about just the power of the media around the pandemic and all of it. And so that's a big one. I know there's a lot of conflict. I can't speak to it sort of from my own lived experience, of course, but between particularly like gay white men and other people in the LGBTQ community, because gay the idea, and I noticed that it's funny just looking at this wheel with this much intensity, like I'm noticing things I didn't see before, where gay men is in the middle ring of the sexuality category, pulled out, whereas then lesbian, bi, pan, and asexual are in the margins. So maybe this is a good segue into the affinity discussion, because the other piece of it for me is it's also about like, well, the article that I wrote that attached to this was kind of about how more or less how easy is it to move through the world, how, you know, which groups are you invited to play in, which groups do you feel comfortable in, which groups do you feel actually included in, which groups, you know, so if that group has a lot of power, are you even in the room, or if you're in the room, do you actually have influence within that group, sort of access to power? I think is one consideration. And so this idea of affinity groups is, you know, it's usually, I've seen it typically in a slightly different context, which, you know, for instance, I was taking this class called Embodied Social Justice, and that was really heavy on affinity groups, and you know, we use that even in, you know, things I built, where the idea is that people with shared lived experiences usually benefit from having a space to talk about that lived experience without other folks in the room who haven't had that lived experience, because those folks, you know, even with the best intentions, may ask questions that totally distract the other folks from just having like a deep discussion about what it is like to live with that, you know, condition or identity. And in some cases, it could go much further and actually be quite harmful, you know, more than a distraction. So that's the idea of affinity groups. And
how do you determine who has experienced those experiences? Because that's like, do you do a questionnaire or something? Like, do people?
That's something I've never seen anybody try to really build formal structure around. I mean, it's voluntary. You just generally trust if somebody says, "Oh yes, I have this identity."
Oh, so it's but it's identity based. So it's not experience based. It's identity based.
Gosh, yeah. To me, choosing an identity or defining yourself by an identity is about having the lived experience of that identity. So I guess to me they're the same.
Oh, but you can't. Well, but that's not true. You know what I mean? Like that wouldn't be true. This is why maybe it only works in a systemic basis. It doesn't work on an individual basis, because we don't know the lived experience of said individuals. You know what I mean? Because there are people there are Black people and white people who have much more similar experiences than white people and other white people, or Black people and other Black people, just as a dividing line, in terms of discrimination, in terms of whatever, you know, things we talked about recently, like sort of police harassment, education difficulties, whatever, you know what I mean? There's no, you know what I'm saying? So then.
Well, sort of, but I think what you're saying is this example came up the other day, which I think is a pretty good way to illustrate it.
Yeah.
I might have a bias that like sort of a non-European, non-American, non-white sounding name is going to be mispronounced a lot in this country.
Yeah.
We're just kind of clueless. And then the reality though is that your name is Brendan and people mess up your name all the time.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it's like you're a white guy with I don't know, pretty straightforward name. Maybe Brandon's more common. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, come on, it's one, you know. So, and yeah. You know, so I feel like that's a pretty decent example. And I don't, but you know, I bet a lot of people would disagree with me. A lot of other people would be like, oh yeah, sure. But when people mispronounce, you know, this sort of traditionally Black name, there's all this other stuff attached to it. Like, and I would say that's probably true, and that's a whole rabbit hole we don't need to go down. Is that a decent example of what you're saying? Like you could be in an affinity group of people with the lived experience of people who often mispronounce your name, and there might be every shade of every kind of person and every gender and every.
Yeah, that would be everybody. Yeah, and
right.
then of course I would challenge any relevance. Like I would dispute anybody saying that as that, and I know you meant that as like an intentionally irrelevant one, but I think there are people who would claim that was irrelevant. Like that could be a microaggression for people not knowing how to pronounce your name correct or whatever. And those people would be, and I'll say it absolutely, would be wrong. Like you would, like, this is the same thing. When you have a reaction, your reaction isn't necessarily, it's valid in that you're experiencing it potentially. Maybe we don't even know that, but it wouldn't be valid as a response. So yeah, but I'm just like, you can't know someone's, this would be racist, right? To assume I can look at a black man and I know what his life experience is like. Or someone can look at a white person and know what their experience, that they have an experiential affinity. They may have a racial affinity, and that is just in the same polls that say that Black people aren't interested in race. Black people are more than other racial groups. And I say Black too, because that's different, because that goes outside melanation, because there are Black people who are lighter skinned than me. Black people do identify closely with their racial group. That means that a Black person would be more, not all of them. That means like 30% of Black people don't strongly identify as Black people, but the 60 or 70%, that means that if you encountered a Black person, it'd be more, if you just had to guess, you would make a better bet if you said, oh, they do identify as Black. So then that you could increase, if you put Black people together with Black people, you'd be making a slightly safer bet, but it's still a gamble. And then if you're putting white people with white people, you're making a huge gamble, because white people generally don't. They don't pull as like, my whiteness is in any part like an irrelevant portion of my identity, which I also think is fascinating, that puts you closer to power. To abandon your sense of identity is actually seems quite definitive, right? Like I don't know many people who ever even consider themselves cisgender is like a brand new thing. I don't know anybody who has cis pride. There might be people, or anybody who has like white pride or whatever, or like pride in speaking English, pride in being rich, definitely. Owning property, yes. Slim, yes. Robust mental health, yes. Neurotypical, no. Heterosexuality, no. Able-bodiedness, people don't even think about it. Secondary education, that's mixed. You know what I mean? So anyway, I don't know, just to introduce that interesting concept.
Well, two things. So one is cisgender is a good example, because I think that's absolutely right. Like I didn't even know what that meant until a few years ago. And I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I'm that. So that's a big difference, right, between us, right, that we constantly talk about. I'm just kind of like, oh, okay, cool. There's a category for what I am. And the value of that,
is there? Well, no, that's the question. People say there's a category for what I am.
Well, that's exactly what they're attempting to point out.
Yeah.
Or we are attempting to point out is the dominant, the default category, the dominant category.
Yes.
It's problematic when that isn't labeled, when that doesn't have a category or a designation.
I guess, but isn't that that's how you do everything, right? Isn't that that's baseline? That's how you, like, when you do medical trials or whatever, you're like, have a vaccinated person or a placebo, which means they haven't had anything added to them. So for a cisgender person, that would be 99% of the population. So that literally would be the word normal without, and some people, for some people, I know the word normal carries this sort of like moral or judgmental weight. It is judgmental because it's literally the norm, right? Like heterosexuality is the statistical norm, or like cisgender is the like statistical to the point of absolute, like the absolute norm. You know what I mean? So then it would be weird to, like, in some ways, I mean, I get it. I'm not opposed to it. Like, I think having a category can be helpful, but it also is, it's strange too, because then as soon as you categorize things that weren't previously categorized, I suppose that's the standard, simply because cisgender is a great example, because it is statistically all in terms of like within the margin of error for most like scientific observations, where you're like, that would represent all of humanity, where you're like, there's enough variance of, like, let's say you varied 4 to 6% of, like, well, we could be wrong. Then the confidence interval means everybody, like literally everyone,
because there's such a strong majority. And I think it is probably, maybe that is the best example on here, because it points out like the danger or the tendency to not know what the norm is, or not know what the dominant culture really is, And then the question I think that's being asked, and yes, of course, this does veer into a lot of certainty about the harm that's being done. But we hold it as a question. It's like, oh, is there harm being done to the people on the margins, when the people in that majority, or that almost all scientific all that you're talking about, like, are so oblivious to that the margins even exist, that we don't design programs, we don't include them in discussions, we don't,
which is practical, but if pursued with an absolutism, like a true absolutism, it could be, absolutely harmful. That's an interesting one too, though, because that's an invented category. Totally. Like, you can't validate, except for intersex. You can't validate, and actually intersex shouldn't even be on there. Intersex is not a gender category. That's a sexual category. So that's interesting. I hadn't noticed that before.
Well, like I said, there's a whole episode about gender and sex. I want to loop back to one thing.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Which is that with these affinity groups, it's not like the Harry Potter sorting hat, right? There's nobody's telling anybody which group to go in. It's more, here's a group, when we're inviting this kind of identity. If you share that identity, you're welcome here.
Gotcha. So white people can go to black spaces, and black people can go into white spaces.
If they share the identity. I mean, if a white person goes to a black space, they would, in that space, they'd have to say, I'm black. Yeah.
Which is allowed, right? Because I mean, if you can say, if you're a biological woman and you can go into a male space, but it has to be, which, listen, I'm not saying that's like evil or anything. I'm not saying it's evil. I'm saying that would just be the premise. Like that if
I'm guessing it might not go well.
Yeah. But that would be problematic, just logically. You know what I mean? Because if race is a social construct and sex is at least bound to an actual construct, gender is bound to sex, like whatever, throughout human history until now. So you know what I mean? I mean, I think that's the scary thing about an affinity group, because to me it just sounds like segregation or whatever, and then or essentially like chosen in tribalism, But again, I'm focused more on ideology than identity, and that's just my bailiwick. And I'd be like, but I wouldn't want people who all have the same ideology to go into a space and start having conversations, maybe longer than 20 minutes.
So I think we're not aligned of the value of an affinity group. But here's the thing I will say, because I think they are valuable, and having, designed a network of that had several of them running for a lot of the I've personally interviewed people who were in them, and heard stories about how valuable it was, and how they really needed a little place to go to kind of share some things with people that they felt relatively safe with, that they could build trust with more quickly. And here's a good example. Like I heard, talking to folks who attended a BIPOC group, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, particularly a Black woman, was saying her voice often got lost in that group because Black women have a very specific, and this actually goes right back to the Crenshaw thing, right? Black women. And so this person was saying she felt her voice and the voice of Black women got lost in that group, and often in BIPOC groups, because it's a massive category. Really.
That's a huge. It's the problem. BIPOC is such a problematic term. Same as LGBTQIA. That's ludicrous. I mean, it's ludicrous. It's beyond. It's beyond. It's too big. It's too big of a category. I mean, it's the same as white. White is too big of a category statistically. Hispanic is already difficult. It's once your category grows to that size, you're like, ugh.
So where I do think we agree, though, is, while I see some value in affinity groups now. Actually, one other thing I'll mention is that in this embodied social justice program, they did a really cool job of saying, hey, here's some categories we think could exist here, some identities and some affinity groups. And one of the sessions was like, and please go into the chat and list, what do you want? Who, and it was, holy crap, it was like the longest list. And then they went back behind the scenes and said, okay, we're going to kind of find, if there were 5 of these or 10 of these, then that's going to become one of the groups. And then every time, bless their soul, the Zoom tech behind the scene was, creating all of those breakout rooms and labeling them all. And so then,
wow, that's a lot of work.
But then it's a lot of work. And then they
Yeah.
turned on the option in Zoom where you can choose where you want to go.
Yeah.
And so, and then they would emphasize, they would say, and please, go to the group where you really have that identity. And that would be the part where, I can imagine you sort of floating these groups and being like, challenging that. But here's the thing I want to say.
Yeah.
I think there's a space beyond all of that, which is probably more where you're thinking, which is, this can't be the final destination because it is segregated. Absolutely. It's segregated by design. And I hope there's value in that, because we kind of, I don't know, it's almost like I'm imagining like at a backyard barbecue, or a party, we naturally segregate ourselves. The kids are over here playing together, and
Oh, and that makes me so uncomfortable.
There you go. I had a feeling it would. I can see you like playing with the kids, in the sandbox. So maybe that's just a clue, generally here. And I don't think it's always healthy, and we're both like hardcore observers of humanity, right? So it's I'm always like, gee, why are the men all talking together? I'm like, oh, well, they're similar height, they're vocal, like the quality of their voices is in a similar sort of harmonic range. Like, okay, that's sort of logical to me, It's just easier to like kind of talk to people.
Oh, there's another me. I can go talk to another me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think we both are kind of terrified of how that is being basically weaponized, like stratify our entire civilization in all these little groups that never talk to each other.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that's scary this is less scary to me, because I just think any experimentation like this is interesting, and experimenting with segregation again, it's like, all right, well, it's interesting. Especially voluntary, I would say, as opposed to involuntary segregation is a huge difference that you've made clear. But you had written a thing where you said, what is it? One thing that rings in my ears is a foundational notion not to pick up the tool of the oppressor in the name of justice. And I was, that's right. I just quoted you.
I do want to be careful though. I learned that from Rev Angel Kyoto Williams, who was one of the teachers of that class.
Oh yeah. Sorry, you credited them in the piece too. Whenever you share. Yeah. And then I was like, that's the scary thing, because then you're picking up the tool of the oppressor, which is racial segregation, in order to achieve justice. You know what I mean? And so I think that's the part that's very scary to people. I addressed this on my Instagram a little while ago, where someone had been like, why are white people so afraid of critical race theory? And I was like, well, because it's super racist from all the understanding of how we've all learned what racism is our whole lives. So then likewise, an affinity group, I think, scares the heck out of people. I'm a playful art person, so I'm like, all right, let's do a weird thing. We can do a thing where we all just get in a group and headbutt each other, and I'd be like, I would go into that room. I like headbutting. That sounds fun. I really do. It's actually it's a satisfying form of combat. But anyway, so like I'm open to that, but I think that really scares a ton of people. They like the idea of like, if they walked into a place and they're like, okay, black people are gonna go over there, white people are gonna be over there. I mean, that's like, for every kid who learned about the bus protest or whatever, they'd be like, no, you know what I mean? They'd be like, this is literally the tool of the oppressor. And I think I just bring that up, that I want people to hear that, because I think that is a genuine fear I've seen expressed, and it's a rational one. But at the same time, I hope they can hear the voluntary nature and the experimental nature of the way that you have described it. Because I think there's a problem there, because it is the tool of the oppressor. But if you're using it carefully, then why can't we use those tools?
I think the voluntary is the key piece there. It's an invitation. But I'm with you. Like it's worth continuing to interrogate when that goes from invitation to dictation.
Yeah. All right. You have a powerful meeting. I still have more. I think this is super interesting, and it's so complex that we could do this again, or we could just be done and figure this out at another time. But I love you, and I appreciate your sharing.
I'm sure it will weave through all the things. I love you too. And
look, we're an affinity. We're an affinity group, because I have an affinity for you personally.
I have an affinity for you.
and kick butt in your meeting.
Thanks.